Good afternoon. Welcome to Kenya News Update today. I'm your host, and we begin with breaking developments from the Gaza Strip, where a new wave of violence has shattered a fragile ceasefire. Rescue officials in Gaza report that Israeli airstrikes have killed at least 32 Palestinians in a series of attacks across the territory. Palestinian health authorities describe these as some of the heaviest strikes since the second phase of the ceasefire, which was brokered by the United States. The strikes targeted multiple locations, including houses, a police station, and most alarmingly, a tent sheltering displaced families in the southern city of Khan Younis. The Civil Defense Agency, operated by Hamas, states that children and women are among the dead. In one tragic incident, 3 young girls from the same family were killed. The Israeli military, for its part, says it is responding to what it calls a breach of the ceasefire. It claims that the previous day, its troops identified 8 gunmen emerging from a tunnel in Rafah, an area in southern Gaza currently under Israeli control. This immediate back and forth over who is responsible for reigniting hostilities forms the core of today's complex and tragic story. We will spend the next 12 minutes on a deep dive into these events, examining the facts on the ground, the competing narratives, the regional implications, and the potential fallout for international diplomacy, including the stance of the current U.S. administration under President Donald Trump. We'll present multiple perspectives to give you a complete picture of this escalating crisis. First, let's establish the factual timeline and scale of today's violence. According to Palestinian health officials, the airstrikes began in the early hours of Saturday local time. The attacks were not isolated to one area, but spread across the Gaza Strip. The deadliest single strike, according to rescue workers, hit a makeshift tent encampment in Khan Younis. This area is densely populated with families who have been displaced multiple times since the conflict began. Initial reports from the scene describe chaos, with civil defense crews digging through rubble with their bare hands in some cases. The reported death toll of 32, if confirmed, represents a significant spike in casualties. To put this in context, we need to look at the broader statistics of this conflict. Since the initial Hamas attacks on October 7th last year, which killed approximately 1,200 Israelis, the subsequent Israeli military campaign in Gaza has resulted in a staggering loss of Palestinian life. Palestinian health authorities, whose figures are generally considered reliable by international observers, report that the total death toll in Gaza has now surpassed 71,660 people. That number includes a significant proportion of women and children. The 32 deaths reported today are a fresh addition to that grim tally. The scale of destruction in Gaza is almost unimaginable, with large swathes of the territory reduced to rubble and the United Nations warning of a catastrophic humanitarian crisis, including widespread famine. Now, let's examine the Israeli military's justification for these strikes. The Israel Defense Forces issued a statement saying the airstrikes were a direct response to a specific ceasefire violation. They stated that on Friday, Israeli troops operating in the Rafah area observed 8 armed militants exiting a tunnel shaft. The IDF claims these individuals were identified as Hamas operatives and posed an immediate threat. A spokesperson said, "The ceasefire agreements are clear. Any hostile activity will be met with a decisive response." Hamas's decision to deploy armed squads from tunnels is a blatant violation of the truce and endangers the civilian population of Gaza. This narrative frames the Israeli action as defensive and reactive, a necessary measure to protect its soldiers and uphold the terms of the ceasefire. Military analysts note that the use of helicopter gunships, as reported in the attack on the tent in Khan Younis, suggests a close air support mission, often used when troops feel under immediate threat. However, critics of this justification are quick to point out the massive disparity between the alleged threat, 8 gunmen, and the response, which killed at least 32 people, many of whom were clearly non-combatants sheltering in a tent. This raises serious questions about the principle of proportionality in international law, which dictates that the anticipated military advantage of an attack must not be excessive in relation to the expected civilian harm. From the Palestinian perspective, the narrative is one of unrelenting aggression and collective punishment. Eyewitnesses in Khan Younis described a scene of horror. One man, who gave his name as Abu Ahmed, told reporters via phone, "We were sleeping, thinking we were safe for a moment. Then the world exploded. The sound of the helicopters, then the bombs. There is no safe place in Gaza." Hamas-run Civil Defense Agency accuses Israel of deliberately targeting displaced civilians and of using the alleged tunnel incident as a pretext to resume widespread bombing. Palestinian officials and many international human rights organizations argue that Israel's entire campaign in Gaza has failed to distinguish adequately between military targets and civilian infrastructure. They point to the targeting of a police station in today's strikes as an example of this blurring of lines. In Gaza, police forces are part of the civil administration and are often involved in humanitarian coordination, not just militant activity. The killing of the three sisters from one family has become a potent symbol for this argument. Their photos are circulating on social media, a heartbreaking reminder of the human cost. For Palestinians, these strikes are not an isolated response, but a continuation of a policy that has brought unprecedented suffering to the 2 million people trapped in the enclave. This incident cannot be viewed in isolation from the fragile diplomatic landscape. The current ceasefire, now in its second phase, was brokered through intense mediation led by the United States, Egypt, and Qatar. Its collapse would be a major setback for all parties involved. The role of the United States is particularly crucial. President Donald Trump, who took office in January of last year, has maintained a staunchly pro-Israel stance, consistent with his first term. His administration has provided full political and military support to Israel's campaign, while simultaneously pushing for temporary humanitarian pauses. The White House has not yet issued a statement on today's strikes, but State Department officials are reportedly in urgent contact with both Israeli and Egyptian counterparts. The key question for Washington is how to balance its unwavering support for Israel's right to self-defense with growing international, and even domestic, pressure to curb civilian casualties and prevent a regional conflagration. Furthermore, the conflict has implications for U.S. relations with Arab partners, including key players like Saudi Arabia, who are crucial to Trump's vision for a new Middle East order. A prolonged breakdown in Gaza could derail those strategic plans. Regionally, the stakes are incredibly high. The conflict in Gaza has consistently acted as a flashpoint, with the potential to draw in other actors. Iran-backed groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon have been engaged in daily, low-level clashes with Israel along the northern border. Any major escalation in Gaza increases the risk of that front igniting into a full-scale war. Similarly, Houthi rebels in Yemen have targeted shipping in the Red Sea in what they say is solidarity with Palestinians. The broader axis of resistance, led by Iran, watches closely for any sign of Israeli overreach to justify its own actions. Conversely, Arab states that have normalized relations with Israel, such as the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, find themselves in an increasingly difficult position. Their populations are overwhelmingly sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, and graphic images from Gaza strain the official diplomatic calm. For President William Ruto of Kenya, and for the African continent more broadly, the conflict is a reminder of unresolved issues of self-determination and the enduring legacy of displacement. Kenya has historically supported a two-state solution and called for restraint, but its direct leverage in the situation is limited. The African Union has repeatedly condemned the violence and called for an immediate ceasefire, framing it as a humanitarian imperative. Let's now analyze the potential pathways forward from this dangerous juncture. The immediate priority for international mediators is to salvage the ceasefire. This will require convincing Hamas to restrain its militant wings and ensure no further tunnel operations or rocket fire, while simultaneously pressuring Israel to halt aerial bombardments and adhere to strict rules of engagement. The United Nations Security Council is likely to convene an emergency session, but given the U.S. veto power, a binding resolution condemning Israel is improbable. More likely is a presidential statement calling for restraint. On the ground, the humanitarian situation demands urgent attention. The strike on the displacement tent underscores the fact that nowhere in Gaza is safe. Aid agencies report that their ability to operate is severely hampered by the fighting and by Israeli restrictions on the entry of supplies. The reported death toll of 71,660 Palestinians highlights a catastrophe of historic proportions. The international community faces a moral and practical test. Can it deliver enough aid to prevent mass starvation, while also working to stop the violence that creates the need for that aid in the first place? This is the vicious cycle that has defined the Gaza conflict for months. Finally, we must consider the long-term implications. Every cycle of violence deepens the hatred and trauma on both sides, making a future political solution even more distant. The Israeli government, led by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, faces pressure from hardliners in his coalition to pursue a total victory that eradicates Hamas, a goal many military analysts consider unachievable without causing even greater civilian devastation. On the Palestinian side, the sheer scale of destruction and loss of life in Gaza may radicalize a new generation, ensuring that even if Hamas is degraded as a military force, the ideology of resistance finds new forms. The moderate Palestinian Authority, based in the West Bank, is weakened by these events, seen as powerless to protect its people. For the international community, and particularly for the United States under President Trump, the challenge is to move beyond managing crises to addressing root causes. This means reviving a credible political process aimed at a two-state solution, however distant that may seem today. The alternative is more days like today, more broken ceasefires, more airstrikes, and more families mourning their children. In summary, the reported killing of at least 32 Palestinians in Israeli airstrikes represents a serious escalation that threatens to unravel a hard-won truce. The Israeli military cites a ceasefire breach involving 8 gunmen. Palestinian officials describe a disproportionate attack on civilians, including in a displacement camp. This event sits within the larger context of a conflict that has claimed over 71,660 Palestinian lives since October. The diplomatic fallout engages major powers, with the U.S. under President Trump walking a tightrope between support for Israel and crisis management. The regional risk of a wider war remains acute. For now, the people of Gaza endure another day of fear and loss, their search for safety once again shattered by violence. The world watches, hoping mediators can pull the situation back from the brink, but history in this conflict offers little cause for optimism. This has been a Kenya News Update Today deep dive. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to Kenya News Update Today.